So I'm trying to debate on whether to wear this. It's one of these wonderful things about getting old with macular degeneration. It's bright in here. You think it's bright in here? Well, sometimes I do. So we'll try it without it, and then I may change in the middle of it, and then you'll know what I'm doing. So I'm not trying to be cool. I'm just trying to stop the glare. So this was billed as how to be a perpetual student, and I guess that's good for a type. How about that? Is that better? I didn't realize that people couldn't hear me. All right. This is billed as as how to be a perpetual student, but another way to say that is this is a story about 14 conversions. So, you know, St. Paul only had one, I had 14. So, and the result of the 14 conversions is having read these particular books and a few others. So I want to begin with a picture of my dad, and no, that's not me, that's him. And this is his library. My dad was a pastor, and this is him at age 90, and including pastors on both sides of our family. I'm a fourth generation pastor. My dad was raised and was a pastor in the Swedish Evangelical Free Church in America, and that's a break off from the Lutherans. And he was dyed-in-the-wool Swedish pietist. That means he was basically a Methodist who was a Swede. And that is, he wanted to always have his heart strangely warmed. Now, he was also a Swedish pietist who read Chaucer. And he read Chaucer to me as a boy, and so I'm 6 or 7 years old, and I'm reading Chaucer. And he had a huge library, and this is his library to back it up, to back up his learning. But I decided as I grew older that I needed to match it, so I did. Come on. Why isn't it working? There we go. So this is my library in Rochester. I got about half of it. And this was my library in Rochester, about half of it, and I had about 4,000 books I had, and now it's down to 400. This, in a nutshell, kind of helps to explain what goes on in my head. This is my picture of my parents when they were married. My dad giving me some advice here, and then my mom reading the Bible. Notice she has a pencil in her hand. My mom was the compassionate part of the family, and I remember very clearly at about age 5 in a small town of Eaton, Colorado, which is north of Greeley, that she fed the hobos, as they were called then, who had marked our telephone pole in the backyard, and they would come and sit on the back porch. She would feed them from her pantry, and I would sit and eat with these men on the back porch. It's no wonder that I'm involved in Family Promise today. It's been there since I was a child. And this is my family of origin, and that's me on the right-hand side. My parents, of course, are gone, and then 2 of my siblings are gone, these 2 in the middle, but there are 3 of us left. And I'm the youngest of the family, as you can tell, so my siblings are in their 90s. I really experienced my first conversion in the small town of Eaton, Colorado, where I was sitting in a park one day for a summer Sunday school, and I felt the sun on my head, and I remember that I decided that the sun was God shining on my head, and so I opened the trap door in my head, or maybe God opened the trap door, but anyway, there was a trap door that opened in my head, and the sunlight shined on my brain, and that was my first sense of being in contact with God, conversion number 1. We moved to San Jose, California, from Colorado when I was in 1952, and I ran around the streets with a couple of fellows that lived across the street, Jose and Charlie Melendez, and we got into all kinds of trouble, and I really became a thoroughgoing city kid. And we rode our bicycles all over town, and we'd go to the back of the potato chip factory and pick out potato chips out of the garbage and ate them on our after-school snack. And then one day we decided we'd clean our bicycles with gasoline to get the grease off. And so we did that in their basement, and I lit a match and the remaining gasoline in a mason jar, and it blew it to high heaven. And Joe and Charlie got their shirts caught on fire and their hair was singed. And the mom came down and said, "Come on up here, I want you to see something." We went upstairs into the kitchen, and the explosion had blown off every dish in her entire kitchen, and it was just shattered glass all over the kitchen. And she looked at me and she said, "You're never coming back to this house again." I didn't. So, but despite all of that, we moved out of town, and I went to the next town, and I was confirmed. They made me move, yeah. So, so all of that's part of the first conversion. My second conversion was that I learned how to be a team player, and I got thoroughly involved with baseball in Richmond, California. As a matter of fact, at one time they had a contest for all the 13-year-old boys. It was only boys then. In the Pony League, and the prize was a signed baseball from Willie Mays. So I won the contest, and Willie presented the ball to me, and I said, "Well, that's great." I put it in my pocket. But we all wanted to do is go out into the parking lot and to see his car, and because the Giants had just moved to San Francisco in 1958, and he was driving a 1957 solid gold Cadillac with 4 on the floor. And we all stood around and watched his car. "Oh, yeah. Oh, that's cool. And then he peeled out and left us all in the dust, and we thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. Took the baseball home, and Mike Jones, my friend, said, "Hey, Rod, let's play catch." So we played catch with the signed baseball by Willie Mays. "Throw me some grounders." So we threw some grounders, and of course, the baseball soon got scuffed up and irrecognizable. So any of you want to know what it would be worth about today? $800. Not too bad. All right. So it was a good time in there, and I also was somewhat serious. I began to be involved in doing youth leadership in my dad's church. Isn't that pious? Look there with Jesus above my head. I mean, that's just okay. But then in high school, I ran into this guy. John Nazar, who was an elder in the Presbyterian Church, Central Presbyterian Church in San Francisco, and he, in his American history class, he challenged the students one day. I'll never forget it. He says, "How is it that in 1962 that we in this high school are holding a slave day?" If you remember slave days in high school, slave day was when upperclassmen would get assigned a lower classman, and so the seniors got assigned a lower classman, and they could, the seniors would order the students to do anything they wanted, and there was a certain price, and so, the idea was that you had a slave and that you made money and gave it to a good cause, quote unquote. So his statement to the front of the class was, why is it that less than 100 years before the end of the Civil War, why is it that almost after 100 years of the end of the Civil War, that this high school celebrates Slave Day? That really stuck in my head, and that is that conversion number 3 was that history has a meaning today. Conversion number 4 happened in a summer camp, and the conversion number 4 was that faith costs something. And this is a picture from the inside of my Bible with this quote here. And I had a kind of a religious experience watching a movie about Jerusalem, and went to the director of the program of the camp, and he said, "Well, don't just say that you're going to go into vocational Christian service. Don't say that you're going to be a minister." Well, I took that as a point of caution, but I still felt like I had been called from God to be a minister. And then I began to read the book by this man, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And here is the one I actually read in 1965. And as many of you know, Bonhoeffer was killed by direct order of Himmler for being involved in the putsch, the attempt to assassinate Hitler. And he was hung in Flossenburg about 2 weeks before the end of the war. by direct order of Himmler. So I began to understand that discipleship had its cost. Of course, I'm 17, 18 then. I'm not quite sure how much cost there would be. Then after high school, I went on to Berkeley to go to school, and then I learned what Berkeley was all about, besides studying, and was about being a change agent in the world. And I graduated from Berkeley in 1967, small little school, there. And you can't see it from here, but that's my dad right there. He was the chaplain for the commencement exercises, which was a whole lot of fun. But there it was quite clear that there was a connection between the classroom and the street, is what was going on. While I was a student there and sitting on Sproul Hall Plaza here and talking theology to whoever would want to bother, I was sitting there one day, and this man on the right-hand side walked by, and he looked about that age at that point, and I said to one of my friends, who's that old white guy and with the white hair? And he says, oh, that's Alexander Kerensky. So here's the quiz. Who's Alexander Kerensky? Him. Alexander Kerensky was the leader of the Russian Revolution, the so-called White Russians, and the leader of the Red Russians was Lenin. So he had escaped to the United States and had a small office at the University of California and was wandering around there in the archway of his mind in 1967. And when I saw him there, and I said, whose it is, I said, well, I got to meet him. So I ran up to him and said, hi, I'm Rod. And so, no, I'm not kidding at all. So you want to shake the hand that shook the hand of Alexander Kerensky, who shook the hand of Nikolai Lenin? There you go, right here. All right. So, yeah, I've always been somewhat of a sycophant. So, and here's actually what went on a lot on Sproul Hall Plaza. This is Mario Savio giving one of his free speech movement speeches. Anybody remember that name, Mario Savio? He was the leader of the free speech movement in Berkeley, okay? He later, he got married, had a child who had severe autism, and he ended up dropping out of politics, and for a number of years was the director of a child's autism center in Berkeley. Interesting what happens. I also was in ROTC at Berkeley, and which was kind of an interesting thing because we debated a lot about Vietnam policy. So here I am. So I was commissioned in 1967. Right after commissioned, I went off to seminary. And there in seminary was beginning my 6th conversion. And there the apron strings of my childhood began, my theological childhood began to drop away. And it wasn't pyrotechnic. I didn't slam any doors when I walked out of the house. I shut them and walked out. But here's what I came to look like at Princeton. That's me on the right. And if anyone, yes, and this is kind of the classic thing here, peace and love by these two high school kids. This is James Dellinger, and that's Father James Groppe. And you remember some of those peacenik days. So it was fun to rub shoulders with those folks at Princeton. The conversion really came, though, by reading this little booklet, The Origins of Fundamentalists by Ernest Sandin, who was at Vanderbilt. And this book essentially undid the evangelicalism of my childhood because it basically said that evangelicalism, as we know it in America, is a blip on the historic radar screen of Christian history, just a small blip. Maybe 40, 50, 60 years, and then life changes. So when I understood that the religion in which my parents had grown up in was an exception to the long history of Christianity, it was then that I could kind of gently set it aside and move on. Then at Princeton. I was still at Princeton, so that's kind of my initial reading as a first-year student. And then I began to run into what it's called liberation theology, which emerged out of South America. And this guy here, Richard Schall, was one of my professors. He wrote this crucial book called Containment and Change, about a theological approach to America's international military posture in that particular time, and the importance of change in what was then known as the Third World. And he was a missionary in Brazil, and then came back to Princeton to teach. So then I also ran into this guy here, Charles Converse West. And Charlie West not only was one of my professors, he defended me on the floor of the Presbytery of New Brunswick when I was being theologically examined for ordination. And somebody accused me of being a communist, and he said, "No, Rod, it's just kind of a run-of-the-mill neo-Orthodox theologian." So he wrote this book, The Power to be Human, on development of secular theology. And then this one, Outside the Camp, which was really, and he went on to head the Ecumenical Institute in Beausset, Switzerland. And this book uses a phrase from the book of Hebrews about the Christians being outside the camp and no longer part of the Roman Empire. And so he wrote this book about China and what it meant to be a Christian in China, because he taught there for a number of years at Shandong Theological Seminary. And the result of his work there was was called the Three Self Movement Church, which is now the public church in China, not the underground church. So Charlie was very, very helpful to me. And it turns out he moved to Rochester in his final years. So I became his pastor. And then I buried him in a little cemetery outside of Princeton. What an honor. I get a little bit clamped about thinking about how important these folks are. Also at seminary was my preaching professor, Edler Hawkins, who was the first African-American to be ordained in the then Northern Church. And he would later preach my ordination. So other parts of this conversion occurred when I had some wonderful friends in seminary. One of them, and with both of these friends, we washed pots and pans together in the kitchen in the seminary. So that's the way we worked ourselves through seminary. And this is K.C. Abraham. K.C. Abraham, this is his picture when he went on to become the Bishop of the Church of South India. He succeeded Leslie Newbigin in being the Bishop of the Church of South India. And then here is Timothy Murere Njoya, who was, this is him in seminary. And we became fast friends because I had some connections. Our family knew Paul Carlson, who was a missionary, was killed in what was then the Congo. So he had good experience talking about Africa and Christianity in Africa. And I invited him to come to Minneapolis. And so he came, this is taken about 1987, 88 or so. And that's his little girl there with him. And then a few years later, he went on to resist the one-party government in Kenya, led by a fellow named Daniel Moi, M-O-I. And for that, one occasion, while protesting this, he was forced they had a protest in the downtown cathedral in Nairobi, and they gassed the cathedral and forced the demonstrators out into the street where they were clubbed. And that's a picture of Timothy on the front page of the New York Times in 1990. I'm glad to say that he survived. So here's a picture of us about 10 years later. So it's these kinds of people really shaped me, because I realized the connection to the cost of discipleship. Also, I ran into the Niebuhr brothers in seminary, and they were most helpful, particularly Richard Niebuhr on the left. And he wrote this book called Christ and Culture. And I really commend this. It's still read. This is a 1951 book. It's still read in seminaries today as a as a basic primer for anybody who wants to understand the relationship of the Bible to a culture, or even American Christianity to our culture. I highly commend it, $5 on the internet. My first pastorate right out of seminary was this church, a Federated Church of of United Church of Christ and Presbyterians in Philadelphia on the Penn campus. It was a wonderful place to be. Church had a long history of some interesting pastors, including the famous 1920s fundamentalist leader G. Campbell Morgan. If you're an American church historian, that may name something to you, but he was friends with Billy Sunday and people like that. So here's my ordination, and glad to say that my dad spoke at my ordination, as you can see here, and here I am getting blessed, and there I am with hair. And I was very honored that Edler Hawkins came down and preached the ordination sermon, came down. I also got involved with a group called the Gray Panthers. This is Maggie Kuhn. Anybody remember the Gray Panthers? Okay, so that's Maggie Kuhn, and she used to be a director of Christian education, or Christian education staff person on the national in the national office in New York City, at the old Northern Church office. And so she retired and came to settled in Philadelphia, and was a wonderful person. And we began to figure out how we could change things about the general attitude toward elderly people, which was out of sight and out of mind in that culture. So as a way to get my mind wrapped around that, I decided that I needed to learn about how to do citizen action. And so I went off to Chicago and went to the Industrial Areas Foundation and learned how to be an effective change agent, conversion number 8. And then went back to Philadelphia and organized and helped put together the Action Alliance of Senior Citizens of Greater Philadelphia. We had 230 senior citizen groups that were from various churches and synagogues. So you had the Friendly Flock of Temple Beth Ami and the Bingo Club from St. Alphonsus. So it was a wonderful group of people, and one of the precipitating incidents that happened to occur at this point was a fire right in downtown Philadelphia, which immolated about 75 people in a nursing home. We discovered that the reason for the immolation was that the city of Philadelphia was immune from state fire code regulations for some strange reason, and they hadn't bothered to put in sprinklers in the ceilings. Okay, so as a result of that, we remonstrated with the city officials and the city council, and got that particular law changed. But in order to make that happen, you have to really figure out how to use citizen power and how citizen power can be used effectively. So that was a real important thing for me to learn, especially how to be a change agent in any location. And then I came along and I met this lady in Philadelphia, and we were married in 1978. And that was good because she followed me to Gary, Indiana. And in Gary, Indiana, I learned about double consciousness. This is the view out of my office window. It's right downtown. And in Gary, Indiana, I wrote when I was applying to various churches at that point, I wrote on my resume that I was looking for a church in adverse urban circumstances, quote unquote. And the pastor nominating committee later said, when we saw that line on the top of your resume moved to the top of the pile. So it was adverse urban circumstances. And the reason I call it a double consciousness is because I had read this book by W.E.B. Du Bois called The Souls of Black Folk, written in 1905. And Du Bois, and that is how you pronounce his name, not Du Bois, basically what he said, that being African American in America then was you had to have a double consciousness. That is, you were an American, but you're also black. And you can't never forget that. Well, I reversed that in Gary, Indiana, because I was white in a black community. And on the first day I was there, I needed a meal, and so I decided to go down a block away from the church to the round-the-clock restaurant. I rolled in and sat down, and I was the only white person in the building, in the restaurant. And it wasn't my first rodeo, so I wasn't all that uncomfortable. I sat there for 15 or 20 minutes, and finally the waitress comes sauntering over, and she tosses the menu on my table and says, "Well, what's a honky like you doing in a place like this?" And I kind of smiled at her and I said, "Well, I'm the new pastor of the Presbyterian church around the corner. Just got here today." "Oh, welcome, pastor. It's glad to have you in the neighborhood." So it was a wonderful experience there. The church is a big old merger, a big old building with 250 members, and our children were born there. But and here's got a couple of pictures to show you. Here's the session in Gary, Indiana, with the names of all the folks. Most of them are dead, except Joe and Lana, and I'm still friends with them on Facebook, and it's fun to follow all of them along. Here's the congregation at worship on Sunday morning. So the congregation moved, when I arrived, from about 25% black to about 60% black over my time there. Here's the alley behind the church and our children. And that's Jennifer, the younger kid. I don't know what she's looking for. She's trying to reach something here on the floor or something like that. But this is Gary, Indiana environment in 1981, 82. It wasn't all that serious because we enjoyed doing things like Marcia and I took a clowning class when we were there. And the family here is Mayor Hatcher and Richard Gordon Hatcher and his wife, whose first name I've forgotten. And he went on, after being mayor of Gary, to be the head of HUD. I also had an opportunity to meet a few interesting people in Gary. This, again, is Mayor Hatcher. And did anybody recognize the woman in the middle? Yeah, it's Coretta King. So what an honor to meet her, and I'm glad to have this picture of one of my prized possessions. Our children now live in the reason we're here is because we have our daughters who were born there in Gary now live in Fayetteville and in Cary, so we're glad to be here close to them. It was a tough town. I had received 9 telephone threats on my life, primarily because we were involved in getting rid of a sleazy restaurant, and not the round-the-clock restaurant, but another one, a bar and a restaurant, in which the prostitutes who were stationed at that restaurant and bar would walk out and see and greet the people who were coming in their cars outside of the main gate of Gary Works. And keep in mind that there are a lot of people, 26,000 employees at that point. And when the light would turn red, the prostitutes would walk into the crosswalk and stand in front of the cars and advertise their wares by humping the headlights like a dog. Sorry, but that was life in the real world there. And so we decided, we put together a coalition of a couple of bankers, the mayor, and a couple of other churches and some business people. And eventually we went and attempted to get the license for the liquor store jerked by the State Liquor Control Board. And we came that close, but then somebody torched the building and did it for us. So while while I was in Gary, there began to be a whole bunch of things beginning to work in my head because I'd had some interaction with power. And I tried to do some thinking about that. So in Gary, what happened is that I became an amateur theologian, and I still say amateur. And I made a good study of this guy, John Macquarie, who's an Episcopalian, and I took his book, and I decided I really need to get this theology under my belt, and I reduced it to these 3x5 cards. And I just went through these things, I flipped them back and forth so I could get the system, the structure, the architectural structure of theology in my head. As a result of that, I wrote this book. This is my Doctor of Ministry thesis project on pastoral hospitality with worship visitors in a multiracial setting. Now, what I did was took the idea of hospitality in the New Testament and applied it. So the D-Min is very different than a PhD. You know, Mac Doubles has a PhD in the Bible. So what I took is a section of the Bible, an idea in the Bible from another PhD student about hospitality, and I took those ideas and I applied them in the life of the church. So what I did was I discovered that people were walking into the church, and black folks would walk into the church and they'd see a white preacher and they'd say, oh, must be a white congregation, so they'd leave. Then black folks would walk into the church and they'd see a white pastor and they'd leave because they think it's a white church. So it was really kind of bizarre. And I had to figure out how I was being perceived. So I did this study on pastoral roles. And what I figured out was when I played it straight, so to speak, and was the regular pastor and didn't try to be the white honky liberal, then I was successful. Successful in recruiting folks to the church, both white and black. So that continues to be a real marker in my head. The other thing is that I discovered that I was becoming more and more like Margaret Mead. Remember that she wrote a book about Papua New Guinea and her observation of the village that she was working in. And my second conversion in Gary was that I needed, as a white man in that situation, I needed to step back and stop being up front. I needed to step back and observe what was going on in the culture. I needed to be a specific observer of the culture and not try to insert my own identity without observing what was going on. And that really became very crucial. And it really helped me do the thesis project, because then I could step back and listen to what the visitors of the church were saying to me about their perceptions of the congregation. It was, as I said, it was a tough town. One of my final year there, one of the church members' child was murdered, and the casket was laid out in the fellowship hall beside the sanctuary, and an open casket, and so everybody was coming to view it. And they did a very poor job of putting the man's head back together again, so it was somewhat oozing. And as I was standing there, a man came in with his big, heavy black leather jacket, raincoat, all the way down to the floor. And he walked around and says to me, "Where's the body?" I said, "Oh, sir, it's right there." "Thank you." And he walked over, and as he walked by me, his coat swung out, and something in his coat clanked on the pole that was right there, a metal pole that was holding up the ceiling. And I said to myself, the man is carrying a piece. He's loaded. So he walks over to the coffin, looks down, got real carefully, look, reaches into his pocket and pulls out a hat pin and stabs the corpse with his hat pin. Pulls it out, looked at it, wipes it off, put it back in his pocket, says, and walked out. He was there to make sure that the man was actually dead. So welcome to Gary, Indiana, and welcome to the necessity to stand back and look at what's going on, because if I didn't stand back and look what's going on, I'd probably be dead too. Our next move was to move to Minneapolis in 1984, and the conversion here was an adjustment to power. And what I discovered, an unusual kind of thing there, that was my achieved status was not that of my birth status. I'm still this little kid with a trap door on his head, but here I am in Minneapolis, and one of my parishioners is this man, Walter Mondale. Remember in 1984, he was running against Reagan, and he got his clock cleaned? I think he only won Minnesota or Maine or something like that. But this is a picture that was in the New York Times in 1984, and in this particular conversation, he was asking me, what should I do about quoting the Bible? And I said to him, Fritz, because he used to be the district attorney there in Hennepin County, which is where Minneapolis is. I said, Fritz, don't worry about that. Besides, he didn't know zip about the Bible, so I wasn't going to tell him that. But I said, you need to stick to the classic understanding of what democracy is all about. I said, you're dealing with a classic conservative, you're the classic liberal. Be who you are. So that was the essence of that conversation. It was a wonderful congregation, and there Marcia was our director of Christian education. The reason we hired Marcia, because A, I wanted her to hire, but B, because Marcia needed to change which I would say, the culture of Christian education for children. And Marcia has a master's plus 60 in adapted physical education from Eastern Kentucky University, graduated summa cum laude. And so she brought educational expertise to that and understood issues of child development. And the previous people were nice, but they just didn't understand everything that a regular school teacher understands, and that is that you have to understand where the child is in its developmental stage in order to be an effective teacher. So she was really very helpful. We became very active in local school politics. I was the president of the PTA, the local elementary school, and people wanted me to run for school board. And we talked about this, and Marcia says, sure, you can run for school board, but you'll get a divorce. So I didn't run. This was also a more light congregation, and that is openly affirming for gays and lesbians. In addition to all of that, I also found my baseball path back again and joined a men's over 30 baseball league. We played hardball and major league rules, and we used wooden bats, and I learned that age and treachery can always beat youth and ability. Another conversion that occurred in Minneapolis was because of reading this book, and I don't have a copy of it anymore. Edward Farley, also from Vanderbilt, Requiem for a Lost Piety. And basically what it said is that the church of the 50s is gone. It was a requiem for it. And we need to set it aside and move on. We're a new church in a new world. And the important thing about this was that he was reflecting for me on about 30 or 40 years of experience. So reflection on the practice of what we're doing was my next conversion. That is, think about what we're doing. Stand back and think about what we're doing. And there was another educator named Paulo Freire who wrote a book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which looks at that same idea of how do you reflect on your practice of ministry and not just do things because, well, we did it last year. The result of this reflection on practice was I needed some tools for reflecting on the practice of ministry, and came across this particular book, 12 Keys to an Effective Church. And we hired this guy, Ken Callahan, who is a Methodist, but we won't hold that against him. And And what he developed was a kind of a grid about how to look at any congregation. And of the 12 keys for an effective church, which do you think is the least effective thing to highlight? Not preaching, not sermons. Having a balanced budget. It's number 12. If you have all other kinds of things in place, then you won't have to worry about a balanced budget. It'll come. Fascinating, and I highly recommend it for any church still. I also then I decided that in addition to the problem we had with children's education, that we needed some adult education, because this is a kind of a classic liberal congregation, a merger of American Baptists and Presbyterians, neither of which knew anything about the Bible. And so this is an example of when you read the New Testament in Greek, in its original, it comes in capitals. So would anybody like to read that? Huh? No, it's not Greek. It's actually English, and this is what it says. See, Billy, dar they go. 1,000 buses in a row. No, Joe, dem's trucks. Some at cows and some at ducks. That's the problem of reading the Bible in English, in Greek, in the large manuscripts, in the large capitals. So we put together a series of a Wednesday evening Bible study series that went on for several years, and I've actually taught every book of the Bible there. I did spend 10 of the summers when I was in Minneapolis, coming all the way to Union Seminary in Richmond, where I attended the Conference on Bible and Theology for Preachers. It was one of the best ongoing continuing education things I ever did, and helped to reshape how I understood the relationship between Scripture and preaching. Most important. While we were in Minneapolis, the very last time we were in Minneapolis, our kids graduated from high school. This leads to a kind of coming full circle. And there in Minneapolis, I discovered something what I thought was quite novel. And that is, I discovered that my role in the church was to be the player manager, to use a baseball analogy. I'm not the star. I'm the player manager. Now, I come up to bat once a week. It's called a sermon on Sunday. Okay? And then the rest of the week, the 6 days of the week, I'm the player manager. So my conversion here was to understand a whole new role for me in the church. And that is, there are times when you're on the field, but most of the times you're off the field and you're helping other people with their game, helping other people live the Christian life and to act out their faith in the world. I don't do it for them. So one of the important things is if your pastor comes up to you and says, hey, or you go to your pastor and you say, oh, there's a new project over here called Family Promise. Why don't you go out and check it out, see what it's like? The parishioner says to the pastor. Now, the player manager pastor would say, oh, I'll go if two or more of you will come with me. You don't do anything alone. Being a pastor of a church is being a team player, and understanding that people on the field and in the church have a variety of skills. And so sometimes you just have to say to somebody, well, yeah, you missed the signal. I told you to bunt there. I said this, and this, and that was the signal here when I did that. That means bunt, and you missed it. So next time I do this, please bunt, because we didn't need you to hit away because you hit into a double play. So the point is that the player manager thinks and helps people think about their acts of ministry, but the player manager lets the players make mistakes. It's not the end of the world when people make mistakes in church. So that was my last full conversion, and that led us to move to this place in Rochester, New York. And that's 78 Mulberry Street. And so in 1998, I was called to be the associate pastor for church and society at a Third Presbyterian Church in Rochester, a 1,500-member church. And I was ready and eager to jump in. And here's the church, a couple of different photos. And I remember standing at the back of the aisle as on the first Sunday I was there in September. And first of all, the children's choir went down, about 30 of them, all dressed in red uniforms. And then came the adult choir behind them. So the choir is, the aisle is just full. And then the pastor and I are standing in the back there. And I said under my breath, using a baseball metaphor, and you have to tell you what it is. When you go to the major leagues, there's an expression as you go to the show. You're going to go to the show. Okay, that's the major league. So I'm standing back there, and I say to myself on a loud hoarse whisper, Rod, welcome to the show, with everybody going down. And John, the guy who was standing next to me, what did you say? I said, nothing. But it was fascinating to move into that arena. And I was very, very glad that I'd had the experience in dealing with folks like Walter Mondale and learned that they put on their shoes 1 foot at a time, just like anybody else. But, to function in that kind of environment, you have to both trust your abilities that you've had and be willing to be open to new things. Here's the sanctuary of the church. This is an artistic drawing, but that's the best picture I could ever find. And so I began to develop, over a 10-year period of time, a program. And you can see the white one, the yellow ones are what were in place. And so I added these other programs in the following years, one a year as we moved up. And then when you put them all together, it looks like this. So I was in charge of 40 different programs at Third Presbyterian Church, mission programs in the community that involved about 435 unduplicated volunteers. In other words, it took that many volunteers to make that kind of thing go. From this, I learned a good lesson, that it takes a 1,500-member church to do this kind of thing, and most churches can't do that. So it's important to scale down. Matter of fact, most churches would probably do well to do 1 or 2 of these things and not try to do all kinds of them. So one of the things we did was we developed, and I was a co-founder of Family Promise in Rochester. So I used to have a mustache. So here we are, and we opened it right in the building next door to our church. Here's some other folks kind of hanging out. Then we developed a mission partnership with the Presbyterian Church of East Africa. And there we took 4 trips back and forth, and this is the churchyard in Nairobi. And we adopted one of their programs and funded one of their programs that they wanted to fund. It hadn't previously existed. You all remember Heifer Project? Where you raise money and you buy a cow here and a sheep there and a goat there and send them around. Well, we focused the Heifer Project concept in one congregation with our money, and I think we gave somewhere around $8,000 to the church. And what they did was they went ahead and found folks like these women who were widows as a result of AIDS in Africa. And they were dirt poor. These are women who are making $1 a year. And by giving them a goat, which was the thesis of Heifer Project, you really enhance their living. A goat gestates in 6 months. They could sell the goat and double their income. Goats also clean up around the yard, and they cost very little to feed. So just by providing a goat for the family, they could sell the kids, and they could also use the milk. And so we saw that moms like this who are taking care of children could really enhance their economic status as a result of a targeted gift that was recommended by the congregation, not by us back in America thinking, oh, well, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. in this community. They said, this is what we want to do, and we said, okay, here's some money to help do that. We also had fun by being there in Kenya. And when I retired, they gave us these accoutrements, and this is at my retirement on a Sunday in 2012. We also had a project of sending folks to New Orleans after Katrina. We had 12 trips that went there. I went on 4. We also had a program for groceries in our community. So here's Rod as and it's a church in the background, Rod as the grocery guy. So I went around with plastic oranges and things and talked to people and encouraged them in the race. And of course, one of the racers was this famous person. And then here's actually the beginning of the race. And this arrow points to our son-in-law, who is one of the runners. This race annually is still going on. Last year raised for the church as well as for several other agencies in the city of Rochester, $60,000 on one Saturday morning. It's quite amazing. It takes about 100 volunteers to put it together. Then I retired. And so when I retired, I decided it was time to put some few things together. So I worked with a couple of folks in the community and wrote this book, workbook on ethics, Faithful Citizen Living Responsibly in a Global Society. And it's 6 sessions on Christian ethics, various aspects of Christian ethics. And it was wonderful to do this with a former UNC Duke professor whom I gradually got to know pretty well, and Don Shriver. And so I was honored to be one of 4 co-authors with Don of this book. Here's a picture again of my retirement party. Then I also decided in retirement, my first couple of years of retirement, that I needed to really take a lot of the work I had done with study in Christian ed, and particularly in church history, Bible, and theology. And so I wrote and rewrote and collated, and these are all of my classes in those subjects. So if you have any desire to dive in, just ask. Then, as kind of the last act of my retirement in Rochester was to write a workbook about how to be in mission in the congregation, how to have a congregation involved and be what we call a missional church. So I went back to this fellow here who just retired as a professor from Princeton Seminary, named Daryl Gooder. It's called Missional Church, a vision for the sending of the church in North America. And a missional church is one which goes beyond toxic charity. And toxic charity is charity that essentially freezes people in their current reality. That is, you give them food, but they remain perpetually dependent, and they don't learn how to be independent. And so we wrote this, and this friend Jim Evinger and I wrote this. And basically what we did was create a Reader's Digest condensed version of all these authors. And these are the practitioners in congregational studies and mission studies in America today. And some of them are dead. But here's Mark Chaves, who's at Duke. And you might recognize this guy right down here. Anybody recognize who he is? Senator Raphael Warnock wrote this amazing book that all Christians should read, white churches and black churches, The Divided Mind of the Black Church. The thesis is, how do we deal with the sin of slavery versus the slavery of sin? The sin of slavery and the slavery of sin. And this is Mark Chaves' book about congregations in America. And here's basically the thesis of this book is, churches should not be social service agencies. You're not any good at it. And he's right. He's absolutely right. What we do then is we form alliances with social service agencies called Family Promise. That's how effective work. But churches should not be social service agencies. So I could go into the details of this. We had five functions of New Testament functions. There are five missional congregation practices that ought to be done. And I think this is the most crucial one, and that is most congregations do charity. And what congregations are recommended to do is to move beyond charity to charity with contact. So for example, you can give groceries to Family Promise, but charity with contact would be to go and spend a couple hours during the day with some of the homeless families in the day center and to meet with them and talk to them. Bonding development would be after they have quote unquote graduated and move out back into the neighborhood. How do we make friends with these folks and continue to stay with them? Partnership development would be taking the families that graduate and create some sort of a relationship among them so that they begin to support each other. So we're supporting here, but then people are connected and they can support themselves, and then ultimately a housing project can be developed in the city. Now what occurs now is, of course, that good intentioned people create a housing project, but the folks that are living in there have no stake in it at all. And so moving from charity to community development represents a new way to understand mission of a local congregation, and it really takes about 5 years for a congregation to move along this. If you take a charity project and you move it along here, it takes about 5 years for a congregation to do that. But once congregations understand how they can promote community development, then the changes that we want to make to eliminate poverty can be incrementally achieved. But it cannot be achieved through charity alone. As one of my friends in Rochester used to say, you cannot you cannot solve the hunger problem in America by feeding it. Well, now I'm involved in Family Promise, and here's Christy, one of our directors, and our volunteer coordinator, who is a volunteer coordinator, and she's a grad student in social work at Pembroke. And so I'm doing basically two things here: Family Promise, and I like to do some Christian education at Laurinburg Press. Now, I'm still somewhat of a bookworm, and so these are the two books I'm reading right now. And that is by Marva Dawn, a Canadian Presbyterian, called A Royal Waste of Time. Subtitle: The Splendor of Worshiping God and Being the Church for the World. Her thesis is, yes, worship is a royal waste of time, because it's worshiping the King of Heaven. It's a royal waste of time. And no, it's not. It in itself will not change the world, but it changes us. And then Why Evil Exists. This is a series of DVDs that I got from the teaching company, and I'm trying to figure out how that works in the world. Well, okay, that's enough. Questions, comments, complaints?
Are these books mostly still in print, or are you going to have to go to the Rare Bookstore?
Rare Bookstore, some of them are, some of them aren't. Rare Bookstore, some of them are, some of them aren't. But I know, for example, you can get this for $5 on Amazon, and this one I got used, and it says something about. And I met Mark, so I got him to sign it. That was it. What does it say? Yeah. The Phoenix Public Library. So, but I don't like to pay brand new dollars, top dollars for new books. It just may as well get a nice used one. But you're welcome to come up here and take a look. And